What is going on, guys? So today we have an interesting discussion topic. Is critical resistance useless now? I think this question has been a kind of a divide in the community, because I did a community post asking you guys about what you thought, and 52% of you said critical resistance was useless and it was no longer good, and 48% of you said it was good. So this is why I'm really wanting to do this video, is I want to clear up maybe some misconceptions. Maybe some people just know that critical resistance has always been a staple on most PvP builds, and now that they're kind of regurgitating information. I'm going to provide my take on if critical resistance is useless. But before we really get into that, don't comment saying, Zilla, you have no idea what you're talking about. MPen is the most staple armor trait on all PvP builds. You just need to go back to elementary school. Okay, don't say that. Just watch this video and I'll provide my explanations and do as least amount of math as possible, but keeping you guys in the loop so you guys understand exactly what I'm talking about. So we first have to establish some principal aspects of critical resistance, kind of as calculations, basic math. You can find out pretty much all of this information on the USET build editor, which is by far the best tool that we have to really understand the behind the scenes aspect of all types of mitigation. So if you guys ever wondered if you should run MPen or not on your build, then this is definitely the video for you. Without further ado, let's get right into it. So the first important aspect of critical resistance is it only reduces your opponent's critical damage modifier rate. Okay, we're going to explore this more in depth, but it only reduces your attacker's critical damage modifier rate. Also, it has zero impact on damage received from non-critical attacks. So if the opponent does non-critical damage to you, it has zero impact on overall damage. Without making this too complicated, we have a few notable numbers I think you guys need to know. So 66 critical resistance equals 1% critical damage modifier reduction. So that means one gold piece of gear, it gives 127 critical resistance, equaling about 1.92% critical damage modifier reduction. Also, to the contrary, skills like Race Against Time or Trap Beast, they give minor force, increases that user's critical damage modifier rate by 10%, or 660 critical damage modifier, meaning that critical damage modifiers is subtractive from someone's critical resistance. But before we really add all these types of buffs and resistances together, there are two key controls you guys need to know. At base, everyone has 50% critical damage modifier rate, meaning if they critically strike without any other buffs included, their critical hits will have a 50% damage increase on their attacks. The second control is that at base, everyone has 1320 critical resistance given to them on the character sheet. So if we take 1320 and divide that by 66, that's going to be 20% critical damage mitigation, meaning if you subtract these numbers, which they are subtractive and additive to each other, that everybody has a 30% critical damage modifier rate at base, if you take into account the free MPen that people get on the character sheet. So now in order to unpack this and put it into perspective, we have to know some basic fundamentals of resistances. So mitigation, like resistances and percent modifiers, is multiplicative. I will not go in depth in this video because I've already done a video explaining this in depth. So base resistances like physical and spell resistance reduce all damage taken and not just critical damage, making resistances overall superior to critical resistance, as with people with Malakath have basically nil critical damage modifiers, because Malakath reduces their modifier rate by 50%, which again is the base passive that people get on the character sheet. So it basically reduces all their modifiers. But remember, it is additive, so if they have like minor force, they have at least a 10% crit damage modifier rate. But keep in mind as well that the enemy has at least a 20% critical damage modifier reduction, or 1320 critical resistance. So in theory, if somebody has, just basic 1320 critical resistance, and somebody gets up to 20% crit damage modifier rate, then that means that they will both cancel each other out, and if you deal a critical strike on somebody, the damage will be the exact same as a non-critical strike. That's kind of how that works. So with that being said, if somebody has Malakath on, it's more than likely 99.99% of most situations going to make resistances like physical and spell resistance much more valuable than overall critical resistance. Even though your opponent can still critically strike with Malakath, their modifier rates to increase their critical damage is going to be very big, because it's at least a 50% in the hole, plus an extra 20% from your base character sheet. So they have to get their crit modifier rate up to 70% in order to cancel out all the negatives against them to get even more critical damage. That's a very big hill to climb to get viable amount of damage with mana cast. So that's ultimately why physical and spell resistances are better in this scenario. Now, to put this more into perspective, the really only counter arguments are going to be Nightblades and Sorcerers or proc sets dealing critical damage, which we will look at here in a little bit. Now, don't get me wrong, this video is not advocating for you to drop all of your critical resistances on your build. There's an overall balance around PvP, but we have to understand that the opponents have to really spec highly into critical chance to even take advantage of their critical damage modifier rates. But they also have to have a decent damaging tooltip for the skills with the critical damage modifiers to even be relevant. So what I'm trying to say is somebody has to invest at least to about 40% crit in most scenarios to be semi-viable. Okay, now they can have a little bit less, but it's not going to be as guaranteed. Ever since mechanical acuity has been adjusted, that makes critical damage a lot harder to obtain. So somebody has to have a decent tooltip of critical chance. So 30-40% ish is okay, but they have to invest quite a bit, possibly drop their maces for daggers even to get a little bit more crit chance. So you also have to have a high enough crit damage modifier rate. So you have to run something like the Shadow Mundstone, or have some good passives like on the Nightblade, run Race Against Time. You know, there's a lot of sacrifices, you know, running the Khajiit race. There's a lot of sacrifices you have to do in order to get a decently high critical damage modifier rate. But also, not only do you have to have a high crit chance, high critical damage modifiers, you also have to have a high base tooltip for your attacks to even matter for it to be a critical strike. So what that means is if you have a 2k surprise attack but it's 90% crit, it's not going to make a difference because you're going to deal, you know, 90% of the time it's going to be a critical strike, okay? But your damage is not high enough to make a critical strike with a lot of scaling worth it. But if you have like maybe a 10 or 11k tooltip with a 120% crit damage modifier rate with like 50-60% crit, that's where things get kind of overwhelming. But again, that's almost to the extent impossible, because you have to take into account as well is they have to get enough sustain on their build and survivability, you know, healing and all that. Critical resistance is not as valuable as it once was. I could see it back whenever mechanical acuity was around last patch before this Deadlands update. I could definitely see running 5 or 6 in pen because everybody and their mother was running mechanical acuity bombers and all of that, but it still hit hard even when they dealt critical damage or even not critical damage, because they have high tooltips, and typically those classes were Standblade and Magblade, you know, the bombers, or even gankers. Now, mechanical acuity is still good, but I just don't think it's good for bursty specs. I think you could see some kind of counter meta come out of this for even me making this video. I just want to kind of talk about this. Mechanical acuity is great for dot specs. I think it has a lot of potential there. It's very niche right now. It's not been really tested. I have not tried it yet. I think it has a lot of potential though. So the way mechanical acuity works now is it has a ramping increase of critical chance whenever you deal non-critical damage. So what that means is the more damaging attacks you have going out, the overall more ease of access you're going to get the chance to deal a non-critical strike, which will increase your crit chance. Now, it does only last 4 seconds whenever you get those stacks up, but they refresh as you gain more stacks, and you gain 20% critical chance each stack you gain. So having sub 19% critical chance is very strong on a mech acuity spec, because you're going to be easily going up to, you know, 40% like in 2 seconds after you do a non-critical strike, even get up to 60 to 80% crit chance relatively easily. But that's only going to be once available every 25-ish seconds, I do believe. I think it's about 25. So what this is trying to say is, in my opinion, critical damage is only viable using the mechanical acuity set, but you're really speccing hard into that. And that's where dot builds like the Magic DK and the Stam DK, I think, has some viability in there. Now, you do still sacrifice a lot. You sacrifice your race, probably. You're going to go Khajiit. You're going to have to sacrifice probably your Mundstone to get the Shadow, or even the critical chance Mundstone, which could definitely be very strong. You have to sacrifice, you know, some CP slottables to get your critical damage up, and your base toolkit, you know, may suffer overall for healing potential and even damage mitigation and even sustain, trying to get this much critical chance. But let's kind of rein this back in And let's talk about other aspects of damage mitigation. You also have roll dodge, which will incorporate well fitted, and you have sturdy, which will incorporate blocking. Now, in my opinion, I think overall in this patch that we're in, with the only really bursty classes you have is stand blades with Calrians, okay? And you're only gonna, one or two things is gonna happen, especially on console. I don't know how this is on PC, but in lag and Cyrodiil, if you get hit by a Calrian's proc, you don't even see it half the time. So regardless of your Calrians is going to critically strike you or not, there's almost going to be nil what you can do about it. But what you can do about it is build higher resistances. And what you can do about it is have more active mitigation like well fitted and sturdy on your builds. What this allows for is more sustain while roll dodging and more blocking, while you're using sturdy. Not just only against critical strikes using critical resistance and PvP, but affecting all damage skills that are thrown at you. If you're getting spammed by snipes and you roll dodge 3 or 4 times, that well fitted is going to take more active mitigation away from those snipes than just having, a few % damage mitigation on critical resistance, because you cannot guarantee that sniper is using or not using Malakath. If they don't have a lot of modifiers, then it's really not gonna make a lick of difference, right? So in conclusion, what does all of this mean? Well, I think critical resistance has seen its diminishing returns for a long time. It used to be a lot better back in the day. It used to actually give 258 critical resistance, and it was very easy to obtain critical resistance through the CP. Now that you have to have a choice between critical resistance and getting more damage, or even more base mitigation against like direct damage attacks or against single target attacks, it just ultimately lost its allure over time. And since they have nerfed critical chance, except for mechanical acuity being one of the most viable options to get critical chance, and most people really don't run it now, I just don't see a lot of value in running high critical resistance specs. I think it's useful to maybe run 2 or 3 end pen, but ultimately, in my opinion, my ideal spec is going to be 2 or 3 end pen, more than likely probably 3, with 3 well fitted and 1 reinforced heavy chest. That's kind of what I'm using right now on a lot of my specs. I just don't see the value in running so many critical resistance anymore, because most of the time people are running Malakath, or they just don't have enough critical chance to take advantage of their modifier rates. So that's kind of my thoughts on it. I still think it's okay, but it's just not as good as it once was. I hope you guys found some value from this video. If you guys did, be sure to smash that like button. And that's it for me, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.